Hello, students. Welcome to week 6. Week 6, we're going to be focusing on sexuality across the lifespan. And so, as we've already talked about, sexuality basically is a part of us from the day we're born until the day we die. And so, the two chapters you're going to be looking at in the Bauer textbook is chapters 12 and 13. So to start off, chapter 12 is sexuality during childhood and adolescence. And so it does start from infancy and talks about different things that could be present even as young as infancy. It gets into childhood a little bit. It talks about childhood masturbation, which is much more common than some of us would maybe like to believe. In most cases, when behaviors start, adults and parents and caregivers will really shut it down. You know, that's bad. That's, ooh, yucky, stuff like that. And that really does have a big impact on how the individual then sees sexuality throughout their lifespan. And so it's important for us to kind of foster you know the child's growing curiosity, and encourage them to engage in it safely or in privacy or whatever, but never labeling it in a certain way, like that's bad behavior or that's yucky, because that really has an impact. It goes on to move into the area of childhood sexual play, which for some people can be common. And so the critical thinking question that the textbook presents at this point is: assume that you're a parent of a 7-year-old and that one day you find your child playing doctor with a playmate of the same age and of the other gender. Both have lowered their pants and they seem to be involved in visually exploring each other's body. How do you respond, and how would you react differently according to the gender of your child? So if your child is assigns the male gender and they're playing with a female versus your child being the female and them playing with a male friend. And so do you think that that would differ? And also would your, and it doesn't ask this in the textbook, but would your reaction change if they were same gender peers? Kind of curious about that as well. So something to think about. The next, it gets into puberty and the ways that our bodies can change and develop and grow and stuff throughout that time span, and what all happens internally, externally, and all of that. And so the critical thinking question is: what changes do you remember from puberty? And for some of us, I think that there are different things that really stand out, either because we noticed something or someone else pointed something out to us, there may be things that we can't even remember, we don't recall. And then along with that is, what sexual behavior starts to emerge during adolescence. And again, this is definitely not in all cases. It definitely varies, but it gets into the sexual double standard. And so this is something that, we kind of talk about a little bit throughout this course, is the ways in which our society really deems, females are supposed to behave in one way and react in one way, and males, in quotes, are supposed to behave in this way and do things in this way. And so there definitely is that double standard present in what adults' expectations of children are. Gets into masturbation again. At this age, obviously it's during puberty or after. It talks about non-coital sexual expression, which we talked a little bit about last week, kind of that outer course as well, kind of related topics. The critical thinking question here is: from your viewpoint, what constitutes the definition of virgin? And I always think that this is a really interesting term to explore, because technically the first time, we do anything, we lose our virginity to it. So it could be like, this is the first time I'm fishing. This is the first time I'm going on a date, this is the first time I'm doing anything, we sort of lose our virginity to that thing. But for whatever reason, we've put so much focus on that one incident, that first incident of sexual activity. And for some people, and I think historically, the way that virginity has been looked upon is the first time that there is penetrative intercourse, so penis vagina sex. But as we know, that there's lots of people who don't see it that way, that see engaging in any type of sexual behaviors could be considered losing their virginity. And in addition, this viewpoint of virginity is very heterocentric, right? It assumes that there is a penis and a vagina engaged in this activity. But what if it's two individuals who both have vaginas engaging in that sexual activity? At what point do they lose their virginity? And so it's really an interesting topic to explore and think about what your biases may be, and what, you know, automatic thoughts you have related to it, so that when clients are talking to you about this, um, that you shouldn't be putting your biases and your beliefs and stuff onto them. And so when a client talks about, you know, like losing their virginity, you might want to ask, well, what does virginity mean to you? Because I don't want to assume that that means the same thing for you as it does for me. And also, you know, exploring a little bit more of how they see the concept of virginity and where they get their ideas about that. It gets into other kinds of, you know, typical behaviors, ongoing sexual relationships, adolescent sexting, which is very important to look at, because in some cases, sexting and, you know, sending illicit photographs and things like that of individuals that are under 18 is illegal, and can lead to some really serious legal charges. And so it's definitely a topic that needs to be explored. The critical thinking question for this is, should adolescents under the age of 18 be prosecuted for producing and sending child pornography if they willingly send sexually explicit images of their own genitals or their romantic partners? And so again, just a really controversial topic, something that we need to explore because it's happening. Next, it gets into sexual intercourse, and it talks about like the incidence of this from a study done across looks like a 12-year time span from 95 to 2017, so relatively recent data. And also percentage of adolescents who report experiencing vaginal sex. So it separates that from sexual behaviors. So it kind of gives you a good idea of what teenagers in this time period are engaging in. And then it talks about different reasons that are put out there for engaging in different behaviors. And so the critical thinking question next is, should parents provide birth control options to their teenage children who are actively dating or in committed relationships, and why or why not? And again, this kind of taps into your values, your belief system, and your morals. And it's important for us to not put them onto clients who are trying to consider this for themselves. So if you have a client who, you know, wants to talk to their parents about getting birth control, or a parent who's trying to decide whether or not that's the right decision for their child, we don't want to kind of input our stuff and say, oh yeah, absolutely, that's a great idea, or no, that's not something you should do. It's really helping them to explore their beliefs, their value systems, and not putting ours onto them. It does get into same-sex sexual experiences and LGBTQ identity in adolescence a little bit, as well as the sex and political discussion for this one is anti-gay harassment and bullying of teenagers, which is a reality that we need to be addressing. And that is followed up by the internet and the way that impacts adolescent relationships. Which is another form of bullying that is very common. And so the critical thinking question here is, are you actively involved in it says GSA, Gay Straight Alliance at your school? Why or why not? If your school does not have one and you would like to get one started, it gives you a website that you can check out. I mean, obviously, you know, all of you who are reading this are, you know, past the point of high school age, but we do have centers at most colleges and universities, or I should say many, that you can check out. And I know that UF has LGBTQ plus affairs office. But those of you who are in school counseling, right? You know, do you think this is something that you could potentially help students get started, students that are in need of it. Next, it gets into some of the potential consequences of sexual activity in adolescence, like pregnancy, the use of contraceptives, different strategies that can be used for reducing teenage pregnancies. The thinking question here is, assume that you're a parent of a teenager who asks, how do I know when I should have sex? How would you answer and why? And again, you might have clients who come to you and ask the same question, like, how do I know that I'm ready? Do I have some kind of signs that I can look out for to tell that I'm ready? And so that might be something you have to process out with children. Again, this chapter is very important for those of you who are in school counseling. Next, it talks about sex education and the importance of answering children's questions about sex. How to do so in a way that doesn't shut down their questions, one that's open to them, helping them to find ways to get their questions answered, even if you can't answer them for them. Talks about initiating conversations when the children aren't asking, and school-based education, which gets into the topic of sex and politics, abstinence-only sex education, and kind of implications of that, and the back and forth. And so a couple final critical thinking questions. Did your parents talk to you about sex when you were a child or adolescent? Is there anything you wish they would have said or done differently? What advice would you give to parents regarding sexual communication with their children? Great stuff. And then the last one, what kind of sex education, if any, did you receive in school, and what could educational systems do better? And again, this might be a really valuable topic for those of you who are going to be working with children and adolescents, those of you who are in school counseling, but really all of us, right? Because we might even have clients, if we're working solely with adults, that want to ask us questions about their work with their children, what they should be doing with their children. The other thing is that a lot of the critical thinking questions in this chapter can be helpful to think about before you engage in the discussion post for this week. And I'll get to that in a minute after we go over the next chapter, but just kind of keep that in mind. And so the next chapter for this week is the chapter following it, chapter 13, sexuality in the adult years. So this gets into kind of continuing the developmental timeline. It talks about the changes with single individuals, so kind of how they connect with regards to intimate relationships and sexuality, and how they find each other, and all of that. It goes into different styles of connecting in partnerships, so cohabitation, marriages. It talks about collectivist and individualistic cultures and how they view marriages. Talks about same-sex marriage, interracial marriage, polygamy, and polyandry. I know that in the beginning of the semester, there was a number of students who identified that this could be an area that is a little bit challenging to understand, or that you need some more information about. So this chapter is a great one to learn a little bit more about consensual non-monogamy. Sex and politics, there's the topic of marriage in crisis. Actually, let me back up, make sure I didn't skip any critical thinking questions. So what was the living arrangement of your parents before you were born? Or do you know, is this something that was never talked about? And so that's good to know, kind of, what your parents' kind of framework is, and where they're coming from with it. There's a little section on sexuality and diversity, where women choose, and it focuses on China, which is a great topic to get into, learn a little bit more about. I think I'd mentioned with the challenging experience assignment that last semester I had some students watch Christiane Ampoure's documentary on Netflix. There's several episodes about sex around the world, and so that's another great way to get into cultural aspects of sexuality. It does focus a section on marriage specifically in the United States, the different laws, and how things are seen statistically. Changes between expectations and marital patterns that have changed as well. And then the critical thinking question for this is, if you are currently married or would like to be married in the future, what kind of expectations do you have for your partner and your relationship? What needs would you expect a marriage to fulfill? Important things, because some people get into relationships or get into marriages expecting things to be a certain way, or certain things to change or have a certain impact, and when they don't, that's really difficult. And so if you do work with people in relationships with one another, that might be something that comes up, or even individuals talking about their relationships. Predicting marital satisfaction, it gets into Gottman's research. Also a section on your sexual health, a true-false thing that you can take for your own information and knowledge. Sexual behavior and satisfaction within marriage, different changes and different statistics. The thinking question for this is, why do you think married women tend to be less satisfied with their sex lives than married men? It's kind of interesting to get into that and think about why that could be. Gets back into non-monogamy and consensual non-monogamy, open relationships, extramarital sexuality in other cultures, swinging, polyamory, so the differences between all of these things, and different terms that people might use. And then there's non-consensual extramarital affairs. So having affairs and cheating and infidelity that's non-consensual. So it talks about how common it is, why, what are some common reasons for people to have affairs, the internet's role in affairs, and the impact that it can have both on individuals and the couples. And of course, it highlights some headlines of, people in the media that have had extramarital affairs. Divorce rates, explaining the divorce rates, adjustment to divorce or breakup of long-term relationships. There's a couple thinking questions on this. These topics, what individual factors can make someone more or less likely to admit to having an affair when they're participating in a research study? For example, would individuals belonging to one religion compared to another be less or more willing to admit it? And so, of course, our statistics come from these research studies. And so how honest might people be in giving these statistics? Another one, why do you think that divorced women are much less interested in marrying again compared to divorced men? So divorced men are at a much higher rate of getting remarried than divorced women. It's kind of interesting. And in the research, the reasons people give for their divorce, men are likely to say that they don't know why their marriage ended, whereas women are likely to attribute the divorce to their husband's problematic behavior. How might you explain this difference in what we learn? Sexuality and aging. This is also a topic that sometimes students will identify as an area of difficulty for them, that they kind of struggle with the idea of talking about sexuality with older folks, or even being able to accept that older folks still are sexual in many ways. It talks about the double standard of aging. So typically the man is older than the woman, but that's not true in all cases. And also when people kind of see that older woman, the judgment that she gets versus the judgment for an older man, things like that. Talks about sexual activity later in life and factors in maintaining that sexual activity. Also kind of has a separate section on same-sex relationship in later years. The thinking question here is, what kind of intimate relationships do you hope to have as an older adult? What do you think that will be like for you? What do you hope it'll be like for you? Things like that. And then gets into widowhood, which is an unfortunate part of being part of a couple, is that one of the individuals is likely to pass before the other, and what that sort of does to that individual who's left behind, and stuff like that. So that is the end for those two chapters for this week. For this week, I started kind of hinting at the discussion post. It is to create a sexual timeline. And so you're going to actually create two timelines, one that's going to go over like developmental milestones and things like that. And then a parallel one you're going to do is going to have like any kind of sexual milestones. So this could be the first time that you remember your parents talking about sex, or the first time you were aware of what sex was, or saw a sex scene in a movie, or read about it, or the first time that you felt a change in yourself, or moving through puberty and things like that. And then you kind of align those together, and like, were there things that match up, like you were going through certain developmental milestones and you happen to remember this important sexual milestone as well? What are patterns? What do you perceive as being normal or not normal, which can be very different for each person. And so how do you perceive what you went through? And the reason I like this as a discussion post specifically is that you guys can kind of see the differences and similarities that you might have. So a lot of people might be kind of insecure about the same things, right? So we think this is not normal, but then when we look around, we're like, wow, this is more normal than I thought, because so many people have experienced it or are currently going through it. This week we also have our second quiz. So our second quiz is going to focus on all of the content for weeks 4, 5, and 6. And so your study guides are posted so that you have those to prepare for the quiz. That is it for this week. And so the next 2 weeks, I'm not going to have recorded videos like this. I'll just have the supplemental material because we're going to have Zoom meetings for the next 2 weeks. So I look forward to connecting with you one-on-one, or not one-on-one, excuse me, face-to-face. And then I'll be back with another video for week 9. Thanks, guys.